Welcome to Compact Warfare from CompactHistories.com, the show where we explore key moments from the history of conflict, from ancient battlefields to modern warfare. This is episode 87, the Battle of Valmy. By 1792, the French Revolution had transformed France and alarmed rulers across Europe. Since 1789, the National Assembly had abolished feudal privileges, restricted the authority of the Roman Catholic Church, and replaced absolute monarchy with a constitutional system. King Louis XVI remained on the throne, but his failed attempt to escape France in June 1791 had seriously damaged public trust. Many revolutionaries suspected that he was waiting for foreign armies to restore his former powers. Beyond France's borders, thousands of royalist émigrés were encouraging European rulers to intervene. Austria had a particular interest in events because Queen Marie Antoinette was the sister of Emperor Leopold II. In August 1791, Leopold and King Frederick William II of Prussia issued the Declaration of Pillnitz, expressing their readiness to act to protect the French monarchy. The declaration was cautious in practice, but French revolutionaries interpreted it as evidence of an international conspiracy. Some French politicians believed that war would expose the king's loyalties and spread revolutionary principles beyond France. Louis XVI also supported war, although for very different reasons. He apparently hoped that French defeat would allow foreign powers to restore his authority. Maximilien Robespierre was among the minority who warned that war could strengthen the army, produce dictatorship, and place the revolution in danger. On the 20th of April, 1792, France declared war on Austria. Prussia soon entered the conflict in support of the Austrians. The French expected populations in the Austrian Netherlands to welcome them as liberators, but the opening campaign was disastrous. French units were badly organized, short of experienced officers, and deeply affected by political suspicion. Many officers from the old royal army had emigrated, while soldiers frequently distrusted those who remained. At Marcaine, near Tournai, French troops panicked at the first serious resistance. During the retreat, soldiers accused their commander, General Theobald Dillon, of betrayal and murdered him. Similar failures elsewhere revealed the weakness of an army attempting to combine royal regulars, revolutionary volunteers, and newly appointed commanders. Military setbacks intensified the political crisis in Paris. The government feared invasion, while radicals claimed that the royal court was secretly assisting France's enemies. Austria and Prussia now prepared a larger campaign intended to end the revolutionary threat and restore Louis XVI to effective power. Command of the invading army was given to one of Europe's most respected soldiers, the Duke of Brunswick. Before his troops crossed deeply into France, however, he issued a declaration that changed the political atmosphere of the war. Charles William Ferdinand, Duke of Brunswick, was an experienced Prussian commander who had served during the 7 Years' War. The army placed under his direction included Prussians, Austrians, Hessians, and French royalist émigrés. King Frederick William II of Prussia accompanied the campaign, as did senior nobles who expected French resistance to collapse once a disciplined army crossed the frontier. On the 25th of July 1792, Brunswick issued a manifesto addressed to the French population. It declared that the coalition intended to restore the king's authority and threatened severe punishment if the royal family were harmed. Paris could face military execution and destruction if its inhabitants resisted or attacked the Tuileries Palace. The document was partly designed to intimidate the French into submission, but it produced the opposite response. To many revolutionaries, the manifesto confirmed that Louis XVI was protected by France's enemies. On the 10th of August, armed fédérés, National Guardsmen and Parisian militants stormed the Tuileries. The royal family sought refuge with the Legislative Assembly, which suspended the king and ordered elections for a national convention. Brunswick's threat had therefore helped accelerate the collapse of the monarchy he was supposed to preserve. The invasion continued while Paris descended into political turmoil. Coalition forces crossed the frontier and captured the fortress of Longwy on the 23rd of August after only limited resistance. Verdun surrendered on the 2nd of September, placing the invaders beyond much of France's established frontier defense system. News of the surrender caused panic in Paris, where rumors circulated that royalist prisoners would escape and assist the approaching enemy. These fears contributed to the September massacres, during which crowds killed more than 1,000 prisoners. Brunswick's progress appeared formidable, but his army faced growing difficulties. Heavy rain damaged roads, supplies struggled to keep pace, and sickness spread through the ranks. The coalition also had to protect a lengthening line of communication stretching back towards Luxembourg. Although Paris seemed exposed, the invaders still had to cross the wooded hills of the Argonne before entering the open country of Champagne. Responsibility for organizing the French defense fell largely upon General Charles-François Dumouriez. An ambitious former royal officer who had briefly served as foreign minister, Dumouriez commanded the Army of the North. He abandoned plans for another offensive into the Austrian Netherlands and turned south to confront the invasion. Rather than risk an immediate battle against Brunswick's veteran troops, he decided to use the landscape itself. The narrow roads and forested passes of the Argonne offered France an opportunity to delay an enemy that had so far seemed unstoppable. The Argonne formed a natural barrier of wooded ridges, marshes and narrow defiles running across the coalition's route towards Paris. Dumouriez recognized that a relatively small number of troops could defend its principal passes and force Brunswick either to attack prepared positions or undertake a lengthy detour. He concentrated his army around Grandpré, while detachments guarded routes at Le Chêne, La Croix-aux-Bois, La Chalade and Les Ilettes. Dumouriez's position was strong but not secure. His troops included experienced regulars from the former Royal Army, National Guard units and volunteer battalions raised after the Revolution. Their training and equipment varied widely. Discipline had improved since the failures of the spring, but the army remained vulnerable to rumors of treachery. Dumouriez therefore needed to preserve confidence while watching several passes spread across difficult terrain. The coalition advance slowed as Brunswick examined the French positions. At Les Ilettes, French troops blocked a direct approach, but an Austrian force under the Count of Clerfayt found La Croix-aux-Bois inadequately defended. Clerfayt seized the pass on September 14th. A French counterattack briefly contested the position, but the coalition retained control and threatened to turn Dumouriez's line. Dumouriez abandoned Grandpré rather than allow his army to be trapped. The withdrawal became confused when some troops panicked, and several thousand men temporarily deserted their units. Nevertheless, Dumouriez avoided destruction and moved southwest towards Saint-Menehould. His decision appeared dangerous because it left the road towards Paris more accessible, yet his new position placed the French close to the coalition's communications. Brunswick could not safely march west while leaving a substantial enemy force behind him. Reinforcements now began to arrive. General François Christophe Kellermann was approaching from Metz with the Army of the Centre, while additional troops came from other French commands. Kellermann was another officer formed by the old Royal Army. He had decades of military experience and understood that the volunteer battalions required support from reliable regular infantry, cavalry, and artillery. On September 19th, Kellermann joined Dumouriez near Saint-Menehould. The combined French forces were now large enough to present Brunswick with a serious threat, although not all were positioned where they could participate in a single engagement. The coalition commanders decided to move across the French front and secure the road leading through Chalons towards Paris. This maneuver brought their columns close to Kellermann's troops. As rain continued to fall and mist covered the countryside, both armies moved towards a low ridge near the village of Valmy. During the night of the 19th of September, coalition forces began moving towards the road between Saint-Menehould and Chalons. Brunswick hoped to compel the French to abandon their position or to place his army between them and Paris. The operation was complicated by darkness, waterlogged tracks, and the need to move artillery through unfamiliar country. The following morning, thick mist restricted visibility and concealed the movements of both sides. Kellermann had received orders to move north and take up a position near Valmy. His advance guard occupied the area around the La Lune Inn, an important crossroads west of the village. When Prussian troops approached, French guns opened fire, and an early encounter involving cavalry and artillery delayed the coalition's deployment. The French advance guard eventually withdrew, but it had given Kellermann time to establish his main force on higher ground. The centre of Kellermann's position stood on a ridge beside a windmill overlooking the surrounding fields. Montivron helped protect one flank, while Dumouriez sent infantry to strengthen exposed parts of the line. The position was not an elaborate fortification, but its elevation gave the French artillery an excellent field of fire. Any Prussian assault would have to cross open, rain-soaked ground while facing guns and infantry stationed above it. Valmy is often described as a confrontation between Prussian professionals and an entirely inexperienced revolutionary army. The reality was more complicated. Volunteers formed an important part of the French force, but many of Kellermann's soldiers were regulars inherited from the Royal Army. This was particularly true of the artillery. France had invested heavily in artillery reform before the Revolution, adopting the standardized and comparatively mobile Gribeauval system. Its trained gunners were among the most dependable troops available to the revolutionary commanders. The coalition army possessed experienced infantry and a formidable military reputation. Prussian troops had inherited traditions associated with Frederick the Great, and many observers expected them to disperse the French volunteers without great difficulty. Brunswick was more cautious. He could see that the French had occupied defensible ground and that their strength was greater than coalition planners had anticipated. When the mist lifted, the opposing armies discovered one another deployed across the open landscape. The French faced east, while the coalition had maneuvered with Paris behind it, producing an unusual battlefield alignment. Neither commander had deliberately selected the ground for a decisive battle, but their movements had brought them into direct contact. Artillery batteries were unlimbered, infantry formed into lines, and the windmill became the focal point of a confrontation that would be decided largely by cannon fire. French and Prussian batteries began exchanging fire across the wet fields on the morning of the 20th of September, 1792. The distance between the armies reduced the effectiveness of individual shots, but the scale and duration of the bombardment tested the discipline of every unit exposed to it. Smoke mixed with mist and drizzle, sometimes obscuring the ridge and making it difficult for gunners to identify their targets. The French position attracted concentrated Prussian fire. Several ammunition wagons near Kellermann's line exploded, creating confusion and causing some soldiers to recoil. The incident could have started a general panic in an army whose reputation had been damaged by earlier retreats. Kellermann rode among his troops, restored order, and ensured that artillery was brought forward to maintain the exchange. According to the traditional account, Kellermann raised his hat or sword and shouted, "Vive la nation!" The cry was repeated through the ranks. Soldiers also sang revolutionary songs, presenting Brunswick with evidence that the French army was prepared to remain in position. Whether every later detail was recorded precisely or strengthened through retelling, the response of the French troops was militarily significant. They did not break under fire. Brunswick ordered his infantry to advance, but the movement was cautious. The Prussian formations crossed part of the open ground before halting as French cannon fire continued. A direct assault uphill could have inflicted serious losses without guaranteeing success. The French line contained inexperienced volunteers, but it was supported by regular infantry and well-served guns. Brunswick withdrew the advancing troops rather than commit them to a costly attack. A second movement later in the day also failed to develop into a general assault. Weather conditions deteriorated, ammunition had been expended, and the French showed no sign of abandoning the ridge. The artillery exchange gradually subsided. Estimates differ, but French losses were probably around 300 killed and wounded, while coalition casualties were somewhat lower. These were modest figures compared with the losses suffered in many later revolutionary and Napoleonic battles. No great infantry charge had decided the action, and neither army had been destroyed. Kellermann even moved to a more secure position after the firing ended. Judged only as a tactical engagement, Valmy was closer to a successful defense or an armed standoff than a conventional battlefield triumph. Its importance lay in what Brunswick had failed to achieve. The coalition had encountered a French army, subjected it to sustained bombardment, and discovered that it would not run. The advance towards Paris had been checked, leaving Brunswick to decide whether his deteriorating army could continue the invasion. The coalition army remained in the area for several days after the cannonade, but its situation continued to worsen. Rain, poor roads, and inadequate supplies had weakened the campaign, while dysentery affected growing numbers of soldiers. Dumouriez received reinforcements and remained close enough to threaten Brunswick's communications. Continuing towards Paris would have meant advancing deeper into France while leaving an undefeated enemy behind. Negotiations took place between the opposing commanders, although they did not produce a formal settlement. Dumouriez used the delay to strengthen his position, while Brunswick weighed the risks of another attack. On the 30th of September, the coalition began a general retreat. French forces followed cautiously, and the invaders eventually withdrew across the frontier. Longwy and Verdun returned to French control, removing the immediate threat to Paris. Political events gave the encounter an importance far beyond its casualties. The newly elected National Convention met for the first time on the 20th of September, the day of the battle. On the 21st of September, it abolished the monarchy, and the following day became the first official day of the French Republic. Valmy did not single-handedly create the Republic, since the king had already been suspended, and Republican sentiment was growing, but news that the invasion had been stopped gave the new political order essential confidence. The battle also changed the direction of the war. French armies moved from defense to attack, entering German territory and returning to the Austrian Netherlands. On the 6th of November, Dumouriez defeated the Austrians at Jemappes, a much larger and bloodier engagement. Revolutionary France, which had appeared close to military collapse only weeks earlier, was now carrying the war beyond its borders. Valmy subsequently became associated with the idea of a citizen army defeating Europe's professional soldiers. That interpretation simplified events because the French regulars and artillerymen were indispensable to Kellermann's stand. Nevertheless, the volunteers had remained under fire, and revolutionary political identity had become a source of military cohesion. The battle demonstrated that the revolution could field an army combining professional skill with mass participation and ideological commitment. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who accompanied the coalition army, later attributed a famous judgment to himself, that a new epoch in world history had begun at Valmy. The wording may have been refined in retrospect, but it captured the battle's significance. Valmy was not a great tactical victory. It was a psychological and strategic turning point that preserved the revolution at its most vulnerable moment. France had stopped an invasion, proclaimed a republic, and begun the military transformation that would reshape Europe for more than 2 decades. That brings us to the end of this episode of Compact Warfare, part of the Compact Histories Network. Please don't forget to follow or subscribe wherever you are listening so that you don't miss any future episodes. And consider leaving us a rating or a review, as it really helps new listeners find the show. You can find new episodes at compacthistories.com, where you can also explore our other podcasts covering biographies, history, science, mysteries, true crime, and disasters. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. Finally, please consider supporting the show directly by buying us a coffee. Head on over to compacthistories.com/warfare and click on the coffee cup to see how. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.